Okay, so we're going to start by reviewing characteristics of plants. Cells in the plants have a cell wall, and they have chloroplasts that contain chlorophyll. Chlorophyll captures the energy from sunlight, and the plant goes through photosynthesis. You remember photosynthesis is their process of making sugar to store that energy. The sugar is then used to provide the plant cells with energy. There are a few plants that get energy from other sources as well. For example, Venus flytraps and pitcher plants consume other organisms, and mistletoe is a parasite that steals energy from other plants. So for the most part, they just do the photosynthesis, but there's a few that also do those other things. There we go. All right, so it talks about, at the beginning of the chapter, what plants need to survive. So all plants need several things. They need sunlight, which fuels photosynthesis. They need to take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. So carbon dioxide is used in photosynthesis, and the plant needs some oxygen, but the process of photosynthesis makes a lot of extra oxygen that they have to get rid of. To them, it's a waste product. They need to take in water, which moves the nutrients through the plant, and because water is used in photosynthesis. And they need minerals, which are nutrients that the plant needs in order to grow. Okay, and I see a question come in on the chat asking what is photosynthesis. So that you can look back to chapter 2, or no, I'm sorry, lesson 2. I don't remember exactly what chapter, but there's one about photosynthesis and one about respiration. So photosynthesis is the process where plants take the energy that they get from sunlight and turn it into an energy that's more easily used. So the energy from sunlight, we can't really directly store that and then use it later. So what they do is they go through a process where that energy causes a bunch of chemical reactions and it stores the energy inside of other molecules, specifically sugar molecules. So plants take that energy, go through this whole big long process, and store it inside of sugar. That's what photosynthesis is. So it's really, really important to the plants, and it's really important to us because that is how all animals get their energy, from eating plants or from eating animals that ate plants. So that's where it all starts. And you can see that what plants need to survive, a lot of it is related to photosynthesis. They need sunlight, they need carbon dioxide, they use water. All of those things are used in photosynthesis, so it's very, very important. Okay. Trees and flowers and even grass, all the plants that we have today that grow on dry land and grow out in the sunlight, they are fairly complex plants. Early plants, though, that evolved much earlier than trees and flowers and grass, they were a bit different. So we're actually going to look at the evolution of plants and the types of plants that used to exist. So the ancestors of modern plants lived in the water and were similar to algae. The very first things that we could call plants lived like that. Early plants that lived on the land didn't have roots or leaves. They had to grow in damp areas where they could soak up the water rather than having a system to pull it up through from the ground. And they couldn't grow very tall. So they relied on water to be around them so that they could have water in all their cells, and they relied on water to carry their sex cells for reproduction. So it's different from plants today, and we'll talk about what plants today do. And for plants to thrive on land, they evolved important traits. So these early plants, they really relied on being in an area that was moist and that had water that could help them reproduce. So plants evolved other traits to help them. So we're going to look at plants at each point of this evolution. So plants here, and plants here, and plants here, and plants here, and they're going to be still plants existing today that exist at each of these stages of complexity. So we'll look at an example of each type. Okay, so there's still plants today, for example, that would be at this point that have embryos, but they don't have vascular tissue or seeds or flowers. We're going to see that's true of all of these. We've got examples of all of those living today. And we're going to learn about different types of plants in the next section of the book, which would be 22.2. At the end of this section, though, they talk about alternation of generations. So the life cycle of a plant involves two phases. Plants have one phase that has haploid cells and another phase that has diploid cells. So it's really important that we remember what those words mean. So haploid has one set of chromosomes. Okay, and diploid cells have two sets of chromosomes. All right, so plants go through two phases. There's a phase that only has haploid cells and a phase that has diploid cells. And what happens is the haploid phase, so the ones that only have one set of chromosomes, they make haploid sex cells, the eggs and sperm cells. And these will meet and fuse together. So they each only have one set of chromosomes. They're going to fuse together, an egg and a sperm, and then the cell that results when they combine will then have two sets of chromosomes. So it's going to be a diploid cell. So they fuse together and they make a new generation that is diploid. Okay, so let me just go through that animation again. So we start out with an egg and a sperm that only have one set of chromosomes. They fuse together, make a cell that has two sets of chromosomes, and then that cell reproduces and makes a whole organism that has two sets of chromosomes. So we've gone from a haploid phase to a diploid phase. An entire diploid organism grows, and the diploid phase continues and produces spores that are haploid. So when this phase of the plant reproduces, it's going to produce spores that only have one set of chromosomes. They'll grow into that haploid phase, and the whole thing continues in a cycle. And there's what I just said. Diploid phase produces spores that are haploids, which grow into the haploid phase, and the cycle continues. The cycle, which alternates between diploid and haploid phases, is called alternation of generations. The diploid phase of the plant is called a sporophyte, and the haploid phase is called a gametophyte. And these two phases can look very different. So a great example of that are the two phases of a fern. On the left is a sporophyte, which is generally what we think of when we think ferns. They're tall plants with branches on their leaves. And you can see in this picture that they have spores underneath. The fern releases spores from their undersides, and the spores grow into the gametophyte phase, which is a tiny little plant. So this over here is also a fern. It's just the phase of it that looks very different, and it's very small. Okay, and the gametophyte phase produces sperm and eggs, and they come together and make an embryo, which grows into the sporophyte phase. So this doesn't turn into this one. It's that this gametophyte produces eggs and sperm, and they come together, and the new plant that forms from them turns into this. But the one on the left makes spores, and each spore grows into one of these. So it's just two different phases of the same plant. They alternate. So let's look at a diagram explaining this, showing this. So you have the haploid phase of a plant that starts with spores. So these are haploid spores. They've only got one set of chromosomes. They grow into a little plant that only has one set of chromosomes. That little plant makes egg cells and sperm cells that only have one set of chromosomes in each one. But what happens is those fuse with egg cells and sperm cells from other plants nearby, and they make a zygote, which is what you call it, the first cells that are formed after they fuse together. And that now has two sets of chromosomes. It's diploid because it got one set from the egg and one set from the sperm, and they came together and made a cell that has two sets. So that grows into an entire plant that has two sets. So the entire sporophyte is diploid. It has two sets of chromosomes. And it creates spores that each only have one set of chromosomes, and then it goes through the process. Those spores grow and germinate and become the gametophyte. And this just keeps going over and over and over. Okay, so that's it for chapter 22.1. I've got some questions for you, and then you can ask questions if you have any for me. So there's more than one right answer here. Which of the following do plants need in order to survive? So I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. Do they need to absorb sunlight, take in carbon dioxide, take in oxygen, get rid of oxygen, get rid of carbon dioxide, absorb minerals? Which of those do plants need to do? Okay, so plants do need to absorb sunlight, so I'm going to circle that one. They do need carbon dioxide, so I'm going to circle that one. Hopefully a little bit better of a circle. Nope, it's still a mess. All right, what about oxygen? Plants don't need to take in oxygen. They make oxygen, and if they have extra, they need to get rid of it. So they get rid of oxygen. They don't get rid of carbon dioxide. They need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, but they do need to absorb minerals. All right, so that's what we've got. Those three things. Plants need to absorb sunlight, take in carbon dioxide, absorb minerals, and it's not on here, but the fourth thing that they need is water. And here's another review question. Which of the following is true? Sporophytes are haploid and have one set of chromosomes. Sporophytes are diploid and have one set of chromosomes. Sporophytes are haploid and have two sets of chromosomes, or sporophytes are diploid and have two sets of chromosomes. Yikes. Okay. So let's just think about what those words mean first of all. Haploid and diploid. So if we think back, haploid have one set of chromosomes and diploid have two. So that means this one's got to be wrong. Diploid doesn't have one, right? And haploid doesn't have two. All right, so we've got haploid has one set and diploid has two sets. So then what are sporophytes? So the question is, are sporophytes haploid or are they diploid? Let's look back at our diagram from a few slides ago. The sporophytes have two sets of chromosomes. They're diploid. And the gametophytes down here are the haploid ones. They only have one set. All right, so our final answer is this one. Sporophytes are diploid, and diploid plants have two sets of chromosomes. Okay, this takes us to chapter 22.2. Again, if you have any questions, you can just type them in the question section. So this next section is about seedless plants. So that's going to be green algae, bryophytes, and seedless vascular plants. So So the simplest plants are green algae, and they appear here first on this cladogram of plants. They were the earliest to evolve. They appear right here before any of these features. So they don't have embryos, they don't have vascular tissue, they don't have seeds and flowers. They are single-celled organisms, but many times they live in a colony that works together. And they do go through the alternation of generations with haploid and diploid cells. The gametes come together in open water. There's no protected embryo. That pretty much sums up green algae. They're very simple. The next one is bryophytes. So bryophytes are one step up on this cladogram, this little evolutionary diagram. They are multicellular, and they do have embryos. So you see how these diagrams work. As you go up the path here, you have embryo formation, and then after that, you have bryophytes. So that means they do have embryos, but they don't have vascular tissue and they don't have seeds. So what are bryophytes? Bryophytes are mosses and other similar plants. They need to grow where it's damp so that they can easily move water through their cells by osmosis. So they don't have specialized structures to move water through the whole plant, so that means they can't be very big. They especially can't lift water upwards, so they can't grow very tall. So bryophytes, that's a big thing to remember about them. They can't grow very tall because they don't have vascular tissue. They just kind of have to soak up water by osmosis. Our next ones have vascular tissue. So let's learn about what that is first. Vascular tissue is basically tubes in plants that are for moving stuff. They're long tubes that have very hard cell walls. And there's two types of vascular tissue. There's xylem for carrying water from the roots to every part of the plant, and phloem for carrying nutrients and food produced by photosynthesis to all parts of the plant. And vascular tissue allows plants to grow tall. Okay, so trees can grow very tall because they have xylem and phloem to move everything around, as opposed to the mosses. Okay, we had a question come in on the chat asking if things are poisonous. So nothing that we talked about so far is necessarily poisonous. So trying to think how we want to define poisonous, because if you ate a lot of them, it might not be good for you, but they aren't something that creates a poison or a toxin specifically, as far as I know, but I've never really looked into whether all types of algae and all types of bryophytes have poisons or not. And then once we get into vascular plants, then definitely some of them can be poisonous. So we'll look at those in a minute. Okay. So anyway, vascular tissue is xylem and phloem. Xylem is for water, phloem is for nutrients. They allow plants to get tall. And then we have vascular plants. So as we go up this evolutionary tree here, we've formed embryos. We have true water conducting tissue, which would be xylem. So right now we're talking about these plants right in here that they don't have seeds yet, but they do have this xylem and phloem. So they are seedless vascular plants. So a very common example of that would be ferns. Ferns are seedless vascular plants. They have embryos and they have vascular tissue, but they don't have seeds and flowers. Okay, and that's actually it for section 22.2. So quick review, which of the following is a bryophyte? So remember, bryophytes are very small because they can't soak up, or they have to kind of soak up water. They can't grow tall because they don't have vascular tissue. So it's not going to be ferns and it's not going to be trees. But bryophytes do have um, multicellular plants, and they do grow on land. So it's not algae either. So bryophytes would be mosses. That's a great example of bryophytes. And our next question here is, what does the xylem do? So think about that answer for a few seconds. And we talked about xylem and phloem. Remember, xylem is the one that moves water. So it moves water from the roots of the plant through the entire plant. The other one was phloem, which moves nutrients around the plant. And the other two answers are just there to be distracting. Okay, and that takes us to our next section about seed plants. So the plants that are most recently evolved have embryos and vascular tissue and seeds. So we're going to talk about both the ones in this category here, which have seeds but not flowers, and over here that have seeds and flowers. And there's names for those. So there's two types. Gymnosperms are the plants that have seeds but do not have flowers. So we generally think of those as having pine cones. So they are usually evergreen trees and ginkgo trees. And then the other type is angiosperms, which is any type of plant that has flowers. And that is most plants. So we don't think about things like grass or rice having flowers, but they do have tiny little flowers. So angiosperms are actually the most common plants. So let's look into this some more. So what are seeds? Seeds are a plant's embryo. So it's a little baby diploid plant packaged in the seed with a food supply. The embryo is surrounded by a tough seed coat that protects the embryo. And why do seeds matter to the plants? Seeds protect the plant's embryo and provide it with enough food to begin growing. And this is great because it helps the plants grow in a variety of conditions. They don't need water to reproduce. So remember, bryophytes and algae, they needed water to reproduce. Ferns even need water for the gymnosperm phase. The gametophyte phase to reproduce. But if you have seeds, they don't need the water to get the reproductive cells together. And this is also important because if conditions are bad, the seed can store the embryo until a better time, and then it sprouts later. Seed plants have a dominant sporophyte phase. The gametophytes actually just develop as a little part of the plant. They're reproductive structures within the sporophyte. The male gametophytes are grains of pollen, and the female gametophytes are inside of the cones or flowers. Okay, so when you look at a tree, you're mainly seeing the sporophyte, and the gametophytes are hidden in here. Plants that produce cones that hold their seeds are called gymnosperms, and plants that produce flowers are angiosperms. So we already learned that, but just really important that you remember them. In gymnosperms, the tree is a diploid sporophyte. It produces gametophyte egg cells inside of ovules, which are inside of the seed cones. and it produces gametophyte pollen grains, which are inside of the pollen cones. And the egg cells and the pollen grains are haploid cells. Okay, so those are haploid, and they're going to fuse together to form a diploid seed. And that's the end of section 22.3. So that's pretty much all that was about. So quick review, gymnosperms have what? Flowers, cones, both, or neither? So think about what your answer is while I check the chat here. Okay, so I had a question asking whether a cherry blossom tree would be an angiosperm, and the answer is yes, it absolutely would. It has flowers, so anything that makes a flower is an angiosperm. And we can definitely assume that all fruit trees make flowers and they are angiosperms, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So for this one, gymnosperms have cones. They do not have flowers. So gymnosperms are the kind of second to last evolutionary trait. We've got plants that have cones, but they didn't evolve flowers. And our next question, oh, there was only one question, I'm sorry. Our next section is about angiosperms. So we focused on gymnosperms for the last section. This one is about that last evolutionary step. We have plants that have seeds inside of flowers. So angiosperms are the most common plants. Of all the varieties of plants in the world, most of them are angiosperms. So like I said, we don't always think of some plants as having flowers, but they might have little tiny flowers and they might have them for a short time. So the flowers contain ovaries, which surround and protect the seeds. After fertilization, when the sperm cells in the pollen fuse with the egg inside of the ovary, the flower kind of falls away and the ovary is left and it swells into a fruit. And these images show the flower on an apple tree before fertilization and the apple that the ovary becomes after fertilization. Right? So why did plants bother with flowers? Well, flowers attract pollinators. Those are bees and moths and animals that carry the pollen. They take it right from the male reproductive structures to the female reproductive structures. And this is good because more pollen gets transferred to the right place when it's transferred by pollinators instead of just transferred by the wind. And fruits develop after the plant is pollinated. A fruit is just defined as a structure that contains the seeds. So some things that we consider to be vegetables when we're cooking, biologically speaking, they're actually fruits. So things like pumpkins and cucumbers and tomatoes and peppers, those are actually fruits. So why do the plants grow the fruits? Because animals will eat them and then move away and then poop out the seeds, and the seeds can grow somewhere else. Okay. Okay, so angiosperms are very diverse, and it's actually very hard to classify them. So there's a few different ways to sort them, Angiosperms can be sorted by type of stem, so woody versus herbaceous. So we can kind of put them in two broad categories. Do they have woody stems or do they have soft green stems called herbaceous stems? Another way to sort them is by the length of time that they live. So you've got annuals that only survive for 1 year, biennials survive for 2 years, and perennials, like trees, would live for many years. Okay, so that's two ways to sort angiosperms. You could do it by type of stem, or you could do it by the amount of time that they live, or you could use this third way, which is kind of weird, by the number of leaves on their seeds. So seeds have little leaves on them called cotyledons, and plants with one cotyledon are called monocots, and plants with two are called dicots. So you definitely want to look at page 542 for a list of all the traits of both. Now, monocots are a group that is used in modern classification systems. So scientists kind of argue about the best way to classify angiosperms. That's why we looked at 3 different ways. But usually they break them down further from those ways, and they do use monocots and say that monocots are one group of plants. But dicots are so diverse that they don't actually use that term to classify the plants. But it's still important to know it because there's structural differences. So when you look at page 542, it shows you how dicots are different than monocots, even though dicots are also different from each other. All right, and that's about angiosperms. So our last review question, only 2 review questions. Which of the following are ways that someone can classify angiosperms? So there's multiple answers here. So we just talked about the number of seed leaves is one way, the type of stem, whether it's woody or herbaceous, and how many years that they live. All right, you've got annuals, biennials, and perennials. Type of cone, that's not angiosperms, that was gymnosperms. And number of flowers is not a way that we classify them. So they do have flowers, but that's not for classification. Okay, and our last review question, which of the following lives for many years? So we have biennials, perennials, zygotes, or annuals. Our answer is perennials live for many years. Okay, and that brings me to the end of the presentation part. If you have any more questions, you can ask them if you're watching it live. If you're watching the recording, you can email or call your instructors, and here's how to do that.